NASA disasters have been some of the saddest episodes in American history, but the details make them so much worse than the stories you may have heard.
The fiery disintegration of Columbia ultimately led to the loss of lives and the retirement of NASA's shuttle fleet. But as it turns out, there's more to the story that makes it so much worse, because it didn't need to happen in the first place. Columbia's 28th trip into space had been delayed for 2 full years due to various issues, but when it finally lifted off on January 16, 2003, it took just 81 seconds for disaster to strike. That's when a piece of foam from the external fuel tank came off and damaged the shuttle's left wing. According to the Columbia Accident Investigation Board, the foam chunk was about 2 feet long and a foot wide, and it hit the wing's heat-resistant panels at a relative speed of roughly 500 miles per hour. However, nobody at the time noticed. It wasn't until the following day that the foam strike was seen during a review of the launch. Foam striking the orbiter during liftoff had actually been a concern since even before the shuttle first flew in 1981. Following the first flight, over 300 heat-resistant panels had to be replaced due to damage from debris, and it wasn't an isolated incident. Most shuttle launches also had foam impacts. But the damage to the Columbia was different. Rather than hitting the more fragile white or black tiles, the foam struck the reinforced gray carbon tiles on the leading edge of the wing, which were thought to be more or less indestructible. So conventional wisdom said that a foam strike to those tiles couldn't possibly cause significant damage to the shuttle, an assumption that turned out to be deadly. A day after the launch, the foam strike was detected by NASA's Intercenter Photo Working Group. Immediately concerned that severe damage could have been done to the heat-resistant tiles there, Bob Page, the group's chair, quickly went to another official and asked him to contact the Department of Defense to obtain images of Columbia. 3 days later, a debris assessment team convened, and 2 members of that group also reportedly requested imaging of the left wing, believing the images would be crucial to assessing the damage. But they never got the images. According to the Columbia Accident Investigation Board, NASA official Linda Ham blocked all 3 imaging requests, concluding that imaging wasn't required and that it would therefore waste too much time.
So the intent is to pack each minute of the 24 hours that we're on orbit with science.
For her part, Ham would later claim to have no knowledge of the DAT's concerns. Whatever the case, though, the debris assessment team was left flying blind, and they weren't the only ones. Without images of Columbia's left wing, the debris assessment team had to rely on computer simulators to guess what might happen on re-entry. Their conclusion: the shuttle would suffer at least some heat damage on re-entry. They just didn't know how much. In the meantime, a week after launch, NASA finally clued the flight crew in to the fact that their shuttle was damaged. But they told crew commander Rick Husband and pilot William McCool that there was, quote, no concern. NASA told them they were only being informed of the foam strike so they wouldn't be taken by surprise if reporters asked them about it when they got back. On the morning of February 1, 2003, after 16 days in space, Columbia attempted re-entry. As detailed by the Columbia Accident Investigation Report, as the shuttle was streaking over California at 8:53 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, witnesses reported seeing several flashes of light. A minute later, 4 sensors in the shuttle's damaged left wing mysteriously went offline. Columbia shed a heat-resistant tile as it crossed from New Mexico into Texas at 8:58, and a final unintelligible communique came from the orbiter a minute later. According to ABC News, a report released by NASA in 2008 indicated that the first alarm to sound inside the shuttle would have come only 4 seconds before Columbia spun out of control. However, either Rick Husband or William McCool remained conscious for an additional 26 seconds, desperately attempting to save the crew. At 9 a.m., observers on the ground could see that Columbia was in pieces, and all 7 astronauts on board had been killed. NASA immediately launched an investigation, with the government mobilizing a massive effort to collect as much of the debris from the shuttle as possible to determine exactly what happened. While some unscrupulous people tried to profit off the tragedy by selling debris, most people turned over anything they found. By March, recovery efforts were centered on East Texas, where hundreds of pieces of the Columbia had been found. And then, unthinkably, tragedy struck again. While searching for debris on the afternoon of March 27th, a helicopter carrying 5 people suffered an engine failure near the Angelina National Forest in San Augustine County, Texas. Though 3 passengers survived, pilot Jules Francis Buzz Meyer and Texas Forest Service aviation specialist Charles Crinick were killed instantly. Crinick was awarded the Star of Texas in 2004, and a monument to the Columbia crew in Hemp Hill, Texas also includes a pillar inscribed with Meyer and Crinick's names. In the aftermath of the incident, investigators inevitably asked the million-dollar question: would it have been possible to save Columbia's crew? According to the Columbia Accident Investigation Board, the answer was yes, if the damage to the left wing had been detected by either spacewalk or the requested imaging.
We availed ourselves of photographic techniques which were not used because it was not assessed as being so critical.
How? Well, the Space Shuttle Atlantis was already being prepared for its next launch. Originally scheduled to launch on March 1st, the launch could have been accomplished safely as early as February 10th. According to calculations, the Columbia crew had enough supplies to remain in orbit until February 15th, meaning the Atlantis could have flown a rescue mission. Once the two shuttles met, Columbia's crew could have spacewalked over to Atlantis for a safe return home. For the rescue scenario to have been possible, though, the damage to Columbia's left wing would have had to have been discovered by the 7th day of the mission, which it could have been if those requests for imaging hadn't been denied.
From faulty O-rings to deadly weather and foreboding warnings, the engineers closest to the Challenger space shuttle knew what was wrong. So why didn't NASA step in? The Challenger was destroyed due to a faulty O-ring seal in one of its booster rockets, allowing burning gas to escape. The rubber O-rings weren't supposed to be burned by the gases resulting from liftoff, but that's exactly what happened during the testing phase. Shockingly, according to the Rogers Commission report, when it was found that the O-rings could be damaged, engineers at both NASA and Morton Thiokol, the company contracted to design and build the rockets, decided that the situation was undesirable but acceptable. A test in 1977 revealed another ominous problem. The rocket ignition could cause parts of the rocket's steel casing to bend outward, reducing the pressure on the O-rings. Keep in mind, the opposite was supposed to happen, with parts bending inward and helping the O-rings to seal properly. At this point, engineers began to sound the alarm. One characterized the current design as unacceptable in October 1977, and another stated in January 1978 that redesign was necessary to, quote, prevent hot gas leaks and resulting catastrophic failure. Despite this, nothing was changed. NASA had more than theory to go on after its second shuttle mission when the Space Shuttle Columbia flew in November 1981. When they recovered and examined the shuttle's right rocket booster, one of its primary O-rings had been eroded badly. The news was ultimately met with no action. Multiple subsequent shuttle missions during the 1980s showed O-ring damage, yet still the design wasn't changed.
We learned that little things that seem harmless can become catastrophic events.
By 1985, engineers at Morton Thiokol had another concern about the O-rings. Their concern was based around how the cold weather could loosen the O-rings' elasticity. Given that NASA's bevy of planned shuttle missions included winter launches, this was a problem. As told by NASA Spaceflight, one of the engineers, Bob Ebling, wrote a memo in October 1985 entitled it "Help" in the hope of finally drawing attention to the issue. No help came. On January 27, 1986, NASA called Morton Thiokol and asked how they felt about a launch in 18-degree weather, because the O-ring's lower threshold of safety was 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The engineers, when hearing this, were aghast. Ebling called his team together, and they all agreed that a launch in such a temperature would be the death of the shuttle crew. In a teleconference with NASA, the engineers laid out why Challenger should not be launched the next morning and recommended that it not lift off in any temperature lower than 53 degrees Fahrenheit. As engineer Roger Beaujolais later recounted to NPR, a NASA official was appalled at the thought of waiting so long to launch. The clear, cold weather that night led to ice forming all over the launch pad, but NASA still decided to proceed. The crew were told about the ice when they were briefed on the weather that morning, but they weren't told about any concerns regarding the temperature's effects on the O-rings. To that effect, the mission was a go. As detailed by the Rogers Commission reports, Challenger's launch was scrubbed repeatedly for one reason or another. Had even one of those delays not occurred, the shuttle might have lifted off in safer temperatures. First, it was moved from January 22nd to January 23rd due to schedule ripples caused by the prior delay of another mission, SDS-61C, and then the Program Requirements Change Board moved liftoff to January 25th. After that, the after effects of SDS-61C's delay bumped Challenger again to January 26th. The evening before the new launch date, the mission was pushed off yet again due to a forecast of wind and rain, which turned out to be entirely wrong. As Gene Thomas, launch director for the Challenger mission, recalled, "We decided we would not launch on Sunday, and Sunday was a beautiful day. We missed an opportunity to launch." Challenger's crew were strapped in and ready to go on the morning of January 27th when another problem reared its head. A screw wouldn't release from the shuttle's crew hatch. A drill was brought in, but its battery was dead. According to NASA spaceflight, 9 more batteries were brought to the launch pad, and for reasons unknown, every single one went dead. Liftoff was finally pushed back one more time to January 28th.
What should have been a day heralded for education turned to tragedy in a split second.
At 11:38 a.m. on January 28th, Challenger launched from Kennedy Space Center. Footage later showed that dark smoke began to jet from one of the right-side solid rocket booster's O-rings less than a second after liftoff began. The shuttle broke the sound barrier 40 seconds up, and at around 59 seconds, a plume of flame began to emit from the right-hand SRB. The crew wouldn't have known about this, as further evidenced by their yells of "woohoo" at 60 seconds, a mere quarter second before the flame began to contact the orbiter's massive external fuel tank. Per spaceflight now, even if the crew had known what was happening, there was nothing they could have done. Just before 73 seconds came the last words from Challenger spoken by Mike Smith. Uh-oh. Immediately afterward, the shuttle was torn apart as the external fuel tank erupted into a massive fireball. A few seconds later, an object was seen descending slowly by parachute. Several TV stations began to focus on footage of the object and the shock and confusion that followed. However, it was only the nose cap of one of the SRBs. Anyone in the know wouldn't have focused on the parachuting nose cap for long, because there was no way for the Challenger crew to have escaped from the shuttle. The Rogers Commission report noted that Columbia had ejection seats similar to those of an SR-71 Blackbird for its 4 test flights early on, but that was when only 2 people were flying. The seats were never meant to be in place for the actual shuttle missions when it was assumed that all risks would have been accounted for and resolved. NASA had in fact considered full crew ejection options back in 1971 when the shuttle was being designed. They examined the feasibility of conventional ejection seats, encapsulated seats, and a whole detachable crew compartment. The problem was the cost of integrating any of these options into the design. Open seats would have cost $10 million, encapsulated seats would have cost $7 million, and the crew compartment option would have added a whopping $292 million to the bill. After the Challenger disaster, the idea of an astronaut escape system was examined once again. A number of designs were considered, but as before, all of them were ultimately rejected due to the difficulty of their implementation. Per the Rogers Commission reports, recovery efforts began within an hour of Challenger's breakup, but the crew wouldn't be found until March 1986. Off the Florida coast, 2 divers came across the crew cabin on the seabed approximately 100 feet below the surface. It was a wreck of twisted metal and wires, and the divers didn't know what they'd found until they saw a spacesuit bobbing in the water. Low on air, the 2 men marked the location and swam for the surface. The next day, the USS Preserver came to recover the lost astronauts. As detailed by NBC News, that was easier said than done. Between the crash and the time spent underwater, their remains weren't in good shape, having at times to be removed in parts. First, Judy Resnick was recovered, followed by Krista McCullough. After this, it was determined that the jagged, jumbled cabin would have to be raised from the ocean in order to continue. As the crane pulled the cabin to the ship, a splash of blue appeared on the surface. It was the jump-suited body of Gregory Jarvis, which had become free as the cabin was raised. As the crew of the Preserver watched in dismay, it sank below the waves again. A search for Jarvis immediately ensued, during which astronaut Robert Crippen even hired his own boat to help, but Jarvis wouldn't be found again for another 5 weeks, 200 yards from where he'd been lost. After failing to convince NASA to stop Challenger's January 28th launch, Morton Thiokol engineer Roger Boisjoly was sent home. As detailed by NASA spaceflight, Boisjoly, fearing the worst, had no intention of watching the launch, but fellow engineer Bob Ebeling convinced him to do so. When the shuttle seemed to lift off just fine, a wave of relief washed over the engineers, until they saw the fireball. Everyone present knew just what had happened. Despite his efforts, Boisjoly felt responsible for the 7 astronauts' deaths, as did Ebeling. Over the following months, the once bulky Boisjoly lost quite a bit of weight and became plagued by headaches, insomnia, and depression. He testified to the Rogers Commission and also sued both NASA and Morton Thiokol. However, his lawsuits weren't successful, and Boisjoly's actions led to a shunning by some of his colleagues, worsening his despair. As told by his wife to NPR, Boisjoly did eventually find peace, however, through speaking to engineering schools about the disaster, which he continued to do until his death in January 2012. According to a report by NASA scientist Joseph P. Kerwin, when the Challenger broke apart, its crew, protected by the cabin, wouldn't have been killed or even seriously injured. But were they still conscious as they fell toward the sea? The answer is unclear. After the orbiter was torn apart, the sturdy crew cabin began to freefall. The central question is how quickly the cabin depressurized. On the ocean floor, the cabin was a mangled mess, but that was due to its impact. Given the damage, it couldn't be determined whether there'd been any breach in the cabin before the crash. There is one chilling indicator of the crew's fate.
Challenge is fast, launch is fast. It's bang, and then it's a 2-minute ride down. And you're conscious, we know that.
Of the 4 personal egress air packs, or PEAPs, that were recovered, 3 had been activated before the impact. However, Kerwin noted that the PEAPs may have been activated instinctively due to depressurization right at breakup, in which case they wouldn't have kept the astronauts awake, as they only provided regular air. For what it's worth, per NBC News, 3-time Shuttle Commander Robert Overmyer, who participated in the cabin's recovery, is certain that the Challenger's astronauts were conscious. Tragically, there was no chance of survival when the cabin struck the ocean at 207 miles per hour. The Apollo 1 fire was a horrific tragedy, but the worst part was that it could have been avoided. During a series of tests at the Kennedy Space Center on January 27, 1967, fire broke out in the command module of Apollo 1. All 3 astronauts inside, Virgil Gus Grissom, Edward White, and Roger Chaffee, died in the flames. While disasters like the Challenger and Columbia shuttles took place during their respective missions, Apollo 1 differs in that her crew never actually made it to their launch. Instead, the accident took place in the middle of a testing day, and even before the catastrophic fire, it was already something of a mess. The day played host to a ton of different technical issues. Most notable were the communication issues. The astronauts inside Apollo 1's command module should have been able to talk with their co-workers in the nearby buildings, but for whatever reason, those systems weren't working. The whole thing really got on Gus Grissom's nerves in particular, and he yelled out, The command module itself was giving the astronauts a number of problems. Pumping it full of oxygen kept triggering alarms for no apparent reason, on top of making it incredibly difficult to even open the hatch. But seeing as how the boosters didn't have any fuel in them, the crew figured that things were safe enough for them to continue forward. One of the primary factors in the Apollo 1 fire was the environment inside the command module. The space was pressurized with pure oxygen at 16.7 psi. Oxygen is of course highly flammable, so any spark would have been enough to create a huge flame. But there's a whole history here that actually makes this a lot more complicated. During the testing of the early Mercury capsules back in 1959, engineers intended the capsule's environment to be a mix of nitrogen and oxygen. But logistically, it would have been too heavy and the mix ratio too complicated. So they settled on pure oxygen at 5 psi. But for ground tests, the low oxygen content caused an astronaut to pass out, so they upped the pressure. The higher pressure was effectively grandfathered into the Apollo tests, but the main difference was that the Apollo modules were a lot larger than the Mercury capsules. More space meant more oxygen, and that in turn meant more possibility of fire. Engineers recommended that mix of nitrogen and oxygen again, but NASA nixed the idea for fear that an accident might cause decompression sickness in that environment, so they kept with the pure oxygen atmosphere instead. Considering the rapid and intense nature of the fatal fire, the hatch to the Apollo 1 command module might seem like a pretty irrelevant thing to consider, but the hatch was no simple thing, and some poor design decisions might have condemned the astronauts to death. After all, if the 3 men had been able to quickly escape, then the tragedy would have been avoided. The hatch was in fact a death trap. It consisted of multiple different parts, including an inner and outer hatch, both of which served different purposes and had to be opened using different tools. The inner hatch also opened inward, which was a problem on its own. The pressure inside the module was higher than it was outside, a good thing in space since it helped keep the hatch closed, but a bad thing on land because it made the door even harder to open. Engineers recommended including explosive bolts that could knock the hatch off its hinges in an emergency, only for NASA to shoot that down. Missions after Apollo 4 corrected both of those mistakes by introducing an easily removable unified hatch, but the crew of Apollo 1 had to struggle with a hatch that was designed to lead to failure. The pure oxygen atmosphere in the Apollo 1 command module was already a disaster waiting to happen, but oxygen wasn't the only flammable issue. There's plenty of technology we wouldn't have without the space race, but at the time, American astronauts had discovered the usefulness of a very different technology: Velcro. It was a supremely practical solution to a uniquely space-based problem. Things that could start floating around in zero gravity were easily secured by just sticking them to Velcro positioned all around the interior of the spacecraft. They'd gotten pretty dependent on it, and it was tradition to customize Velcro positions prior to missions, to the point that fire prevention rules were getting forgotten. After all, Velcro is flammable, and it was getting stuck to places less than a foot from potential ignition sources. On its own, that was already courting danger, but Apollo 1 was even worse. Accounts of the command module describe it as wall-to-wall Velcro. No one realized until afterward that the increased oxygen content would cause these things to burn twice as fast as in earlier tests. All in all, Michael Collins later calling the module a tinderbox was quite accurate.
At 17 psi pure oxygen, Velcro explodes.
Many of the failures that led to the Apollo 1 tragedy were technical in nature. However, some of the factors were pure human error. On one hand, this wasn't a bunch of amateurs who were constantly making mistakes. Astronaut Michael Collins responded to the official NASA report on the disaster by explaining that even the smartest of people could miss the most obvious things, stating, "I don't know why we're blind to them. I mean, it makes us think that the quality of our engineering across the board was juvenile, yet it wasn't. It was very good engineering."
There's so many things that can go wrong. The machinery is compact but complex, extremely complex.
But that blindness might also have been a bit more intentional. Earlier in the decade, President John F. Kennedy had promised that people would watch the moon landing, and that started putting pressure on NASA. As a result, the teams working on Apollo 1 were taking risks and ignoring problems. Flight Director Gene Kranz explained that there were plenty of botched simulations. Plans were far from finalized, and procedures kept changing over and over, but nobody did anything to address it. All anyone wanted was to keep their schedule, so they kept pretending there weren't issues. In taking the blame for the tragedy, Krantz summed things up by saying, "We were rolling the dice, hoping that things would come together by launch day, when in our hearts we knew it would take a miracle." In much the same way that the Challenger space shuttle explosion could have been avoided, the same could be said of Apollo 1. Had technicians just seen the dangers or kept safety protocols in mind, then maybe 3 men wouldn't have died on that day. But it goes far deeper than technical mistakes. NASA officials were explicitly told how much danger they were reporting, and they chose to ignore it. The contractors who recommended that the Apollo missions be tested using a mix of nitrogen and oxygen were completely shot down by NASA officials. Over the course of multiple different arguments, they were told just to do their job without question, despite internal notes fully recognizing the validity of those concerns, one of which even mentions, "It has been observed that a number of otherwise non-flammable materials, even human skin, will burst into flame in a pure oxygen atmosphere." Officially, NASA's response was more or less indifferent, expressing faith that a fire was unlikely. But once again, internal documents betray that confidence. The program's director, Joe Shea, privately noted, "The problem is sticky. We think we have enough margin to keep fire from starting. If one ever does, we do have problems." In retrospect, there are a lot of reasons to think that Apollo 1 was a doomed mission from the start, whether that has to do with rather obvious unsafe testing parameters or the other errors and mishaps that had already occurred earlier that day. But the most telling thing might be the fact that those directly involved in the mission could see the problems coming from a mile away. The 3 astronauts, and Gus Grissom in particular, seemed to have some pretty major reservations about the fate of their mission.
There is some risk. I recognize it, but just try to take as much of that out as we can during the pre-testing.
Grissom reportedly told a journalist that he'd consider the mission successful if he just got his men home alive. A worthy goal, but not exactly a high bar. Astronaut Wally Schirra even told him, "If you get the slightest glitch, get out of there. I don't like it." To really make their feelings known, the 3 men of Apollo 1 even went so far as to take a mocking photo, which has instead become tragically ironic, all of them with their heads bowed in prayer, just hoping they would come home safely. And they had good reason to be concerned. The craft was undergoing constant modifications to both its hardware and software. Said hardware was literally broken or leaking at times, and those problems were well known among the crew.
It had so many parts, it seems, that people lost count. Some technicians say it had 2 million. Some say 3.
Of course, there's no ignoring the fact that the Apollo 1 disaster led to the deaths of Grissom, White, and Chaffee, but it's also worth mentioning that the other technicians present at the scene lived through a harrowing experience of their own. Though the crew running the tests was spread throughout multiple rooms, the command module was directly connected to an area called a White Room. The technicians stationed in that room reacted immediately to the fire, trying to free their friends, only to be blasted by columns of fire themselves as pressure vessels ruptured and sent flames arcing toward them. Those who arrived in the room later found it filled with fire and smoke, ashes, and burning pieces of Teflon. The men continued trying to pry the hatch open, choking on fumes and blinded by smoke, all while knowing that a nearby escape rocket would explode if the fire got to it. Given the string of mechanical failures, lapses in judgment, and unintentional blindness that culminated in a near-literal powder keg on that tragic day in 1967, it's a small comfort to know that there was probably very little suffering when Grissom, White, and Chaffee were killed by that fire, because the fire wasn't what killed them. at least not directly. Of course, the fire did cause extensive burns to all 3 men, but autopsies determined that the majority of those injuries were suffered post-mortem. The fire actually burned through the oxygen hoses on the astronauts' suits, and they quickly fell unconscious due to the carbon monoxide flooding their suits. Officially, they passed away from asphyxiation and cardiac arrest. Several days later, sobered and resolute, Gene Kranz told his team, "We were too gung-ho about the schedule, and we locked out all of the problems we saw each day in our work. Every element of the program was in trouble, and so were we. I don't know what Thompson's committee will find as the cause, but I know what I find. We are the cause. We were not ready. We did not do our job." After the tragedy, NASA implemented major overhauls of the Apollo program to ensure it would never happen again. Engineers got their oxygen-nitrogen mix. The module hatch was redesigned from the ground up. Live wires were shielded in metal. Those and other changes led to the successes of later Apollo missions and arguably the success of the entire space program. Perhaps the greatest tragedy is that Gus Grissom, Edward White, and Roger Chaffee never got to see the monumental achievements they paid so dearly to bring about.